The focus of the following documentary is to address fan claims as to whether or not a Hollywood movie adaptation of a Broadway stage play is or is not historically accurate. That is the sole focus of this documentary. Questions regarding the inappropriate nature of the film being reviewed is not the focus of this video. That said, it is the position of this channel that one cannot learn from history if works of art from the past are banned. The incidents described in this video are true to historical fact, and a complete bibliography, as well as the link to an in-depth 70-page free ebook will be provided in the description below. 1978's Grease. Arguably, no other film set in the past is so firmly identified with the time period that it portrays that even today, decades after its initial hit, phenomenal box office release, say the words the 1950s and images inspired by this movie often come to mind. To the mainstream, 1978's Grease is the 50s. But is it history, as some blogs, articles, and even documentary videos actually claim? In short, when it comes to the historical youth cultures of the 1950s and early 1960s, is Grease the word? Before we start, this is the Hepcats 1950s and early 60s teen culture history channel. If you're a fan of all things related to historical vintage rock and roll era culture, then don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and tell your friends about it. We want to get the history out there. This statement might seem obvious, but in order to understand, from a historian's perspective, what we mean by a 1950s teenage gang, we have to look at the original source material. That is, the 1971 Kingston Mines theatrical version, and the somewhat cleaned up 1972 Broadway version, which can still be read through the Samuel French edition. The following scene, written out of the film, takes place after the dance, as Frenchie is waiting around, trying to decide if she should drop out of beauty school. Kenickie, Pudsey, Duty, and Sonny enter the stage, armed with weapons. No, not a water pistol, actual weapons, with Sonny brandishing an improvised firearm, a zip gun. They have been challenged to a rumble by a rival gang because at the dance, Kenickie and Danny danced with one of the girls who belonged to that other gang, the character of Cha-Cha. This was seen as an act of disrespect over club ownership of the girl Cha-Cha. Sonny is more than willing to take up the challenge by bringing a gun to the rumble. Yes, this character, who in the movie leads the other T-Birds in routines from the Three Stooges to the annoyance of Danny for being uncool. In the stage versions, however, the Burger Palace boys, who fans of the film would know as the renamed T-Birds, show just how cool, or even how bad they are, by risking a potentially lethal physical encounter with a rival gang over rep, in order to prove that they are stone or legitimate jitterbugs, an actual fighting 50s era street club. Sounds more like West Side Story than what we normally think of when talking about Grease. However, since this original version of Grease was still a comedy, albeit a dark comedy, a style of deliberately offensive humor designed to laugh at subjects that are considered to be serious, taboo, or even tragic, the gang rivals don't show. So in their frustration, our boys almost turned their weapons on each other. Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Considering that real-life 1950s incidents of teen gang-related fatalities involving firearms often occurred at dances and often were over the possession of girls, such as, for example, the Forsyth Street Boys versus Sportsmen gang war in Manhattan's Lower East Side, which resulted in the deaths of 12-year-old Julio Rosario and 15-year-old Teresa G. in August of 1959, yes, we could say that this plot point of Grease, that is, from the stage versions, was historically accurate. The fatal absurdity of gang life, as well as the more often discussed 50s-era double standards of sexuality, were courtesy of show creators Warren Casey and especially Jim Jacobs, who largely based this version of Grease on Jacobs' experiences at William Howard Taft High School in Chicago's Northwest Side in the late 1950s. All of that was removed by these gentlemen when producer Alan Carr obtained the film rights in 1976. The film's director, Randall Kleiser, even admitted in his published memoirs that the gritty inner-city elements, which were already toned down in the 1972 Broadway version, were replaced with a suburban, middle-class setting. And just like with the much more often discussed 50s-era double standards regarding sex, 1950s teen exploitation film tropes were also lampooned for the film version, along with sitcom tropes and elements of fantasy, that flying car, in order for the film to appeal to a broader and younger audience. A modern analogy would be to have a musical set in the good old days of the 1980s, with characters based on the Crips and the Bloods, but having them behave, act, and talk like Valley Girls. It's all from the 80s, so it's all the same, right? That was the mindset of the filmmakers in regards to 1950s youth, to the understandable frustration of Jim Jacobs.
What did you think of the movie? Were you happy with the treatment that they gave it?
My main concern was that this was really a show that was like a blue-collar musical, more about the kids who grew up in the industrial inner cities of the Midwest, like Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, and New York, Philly, of course. But it wasn't a West Coast thing where I thought to myself, oh no, if they film it out there, it's going to be like Beach Blanket Bingo. And I remember Alan Carr, who was co-producer with Robert Stigwood, who grew up in the Chicago suburbs, saying, oh, don't worry, Jim, no, we're going to keep it. These are the inner city kids. It's Blackboard Jungle and da-da-da-da. And that first scene when Warren and I were at the movie for this back, and we see Love is a Many, suddenly in Malibu, you know.
Curiously, Jim Jacobs' script was originally intended as a throwback answer to the hippie musical Hair. Hair to Grease, get it? In this 1971 version of Grease, Danny and Sandy's romance was just one of several plot points. And rather than opening at the beach, it opens at a then-contemporary high school reunion, with Patty and Eugene lamenting how the Burger Palace boys are no longer among the living, implying they're going missing in action in Vietnam. Being a musical, Grease has to have dancing, and being set amidst the backdrop of 1950s youth, a sock hop is in order. In the play, it's a high school dance hosted by a popular local Chicago DJ, along the lines of WIND's Howard Miller. In the movie, it's a broadcast at Rydell High of a nationally syndicated TV teen dance show, National Bandstand, a spoof of Dick Clark's American Bandstand. From a comedy, fantasy, and musical point of view, made at the height of the 1970s craze for 50s nostalgia, that change makes sense. However, any claims of historical accuracy are out the window because no 1950s member of a fighting teen gang would have wanted to appear on Clark's American Bandstand. It was an open secret among the teens in Philadelphia that some of the boys who danced on American Bandstand were closeted homosexuals. And one of the things that the gang cultures of the 1950s did, besides fighting and occasionally murdering each other over possession of girls, turf, and prestige, was, sadly, the act of harassing and physically bullying known homosexuals. It was all about projecting masculinity, and when they weren't seriously stabbing and shooting at each other, Philadelphia's youth gangs went on what they referred to as fag bashing, for the fun of it. And the regular dancers on American Bandstand were on their fun list. Regulars Frank Brancaccio and Eddie Kelly reported that whenever they would be recognized in their neighborhoods, gang teens would yell out at them, with "bandstand faggot" being a favorite insult. Curiously, one regular who suffered a beating at the hands of a Philly gang was Ken Rossi, a straight heterosexual. Guilt by association, and for a gang teen to dance on Bandstand would have been an association with homosexuality, an affront to their view of masculinity. Another affront to a 1950s gang member's view of manhood was being inept at sports. That's right, in Grease, the movie that is, it's heavily implied that 1950s gangs were naturally unfamiliar with sports, and by design, unathletic. The reality, however, is that one of the most important non-violent and legal activities that 50s era youth gangs engaged in was sports, with baseball being high on the list. Yes, it's funny to see Danny do this. It is funny. But if we're making claims of historical accuracy regarding 1950s teens, many gangs even started out as baseball teams. The Navajos, who gained notoriety in 1955 for the shooting death of 15-year-old William Blankenship, started out as a stickball club, while the Rebels, who gained notoriety for the beating death of Farragut High honor student Alvin Palmer in 1957, started out as a baseball club. And you thought that when we mentioned non-violent legal activities of 50s gangs, you probably thought we were going to mention hot rodding and car customizing. Actually, most inner-city gang members were either too poor or too occupied in protecting their turf to engage in car-related activities, beyond just simple driving, which of course many of them did. Let's talk about those bad boy car clubs of the 1950s. It turns out that most of those juvenile delinquent bad boy car clubs of the 1950s consisted of boys who engaged in blood drives, fundraisers for both muscular dystrophy and orphans, and car safety education. Wait, what? The golden age of car culture, which was indeed the late 1950s and early 60s, the setting for Grease, predates the 50s by decades, with the dry lake beds of Southern California providing natural spaces for youngsters to test their creations, often modifications of Ford Model Ts, against each other in friendly roadster competition. This was the beginning of hot rod culture. Customizing, a distinct yet related activity, also has its roots in pre-World War II Southern California. Altering the fenders, the suspension, and even the engines, all seen in the film version of Grease, were activities that enthusiasts engaged in. The two hobbies, rods and customs, grew in popularity after World War II, with the young of the newly growing suburban middle class able to now afford and engage in the activity. Encouraged by the founding of Robert Peterson's and Wally Park's Hot Rod magazine in 1948 and the founding of Park's National Hot Rod Association 3 years later in 1951, it was that organization that helped to reduce the acts of illegal street racing, which did indeed result in fatalities early in the culture's post-World War II incarnation. The NHRA did such a thorough job that by the late 1950s, clear distinctions in the press were made between teen car clubs and fighting youth gangs. For every news report of a teen gang fatality, there were also news reports of teen car clubs engaging in charitable community fundraising activities, sometimes even in the same cities, though the two groups were probably across town from each other. Car clubs were the result of youth gaining from the post-World War II economic boom. Youth gangs, oftentimes the result of families whose veteran fathers either suffered from undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder or who had died during World War II, were the result of the sacrifices from that war. Teen car culture and fighting teen youth gangs were, for the most part, separate and distinct subcultures during the 1950s. For the most part, there was a car club shooting that shocked Artesia, California, that, just like with that dance-related gang shooting in New York, occurred in 1959, the year that Grease takes place. That car club shooting at the Moose Lodge Hall was shocking, primarily because it seemed out of character for the culture. As stated, Jim Jacobs' stage play was based on real experiences and people that attended Taft High in the late 50s. The Pink Ladies, for instance, were a real club of Chicago teen girls. By the nature of its creation, the 1971 stage play was accurate. But what about the 1978 movie, so altered by Stigwood, Carr, Woodard, and Kleiser to appeal to a mainstream audience that even the high school ended up being the same Southern California school that, decades later, was used in a Britney Spears video? That's as suburban mainstream as you can get. Is there any part of the 1978 movie that actually is historically accurate for the time period setting, as some fans claim in social media comments, blogs, articles, and videos? Well, yes, there is one aspect of the movie that is historically accurate. It's actually a part of the main plot point of the movie, and it's so accurate, in fact, that it applies to human behavior of any time period. But, just like with that one exception that distinguishes car clubs from street gangs, if you don't yet know what that part of Grease is that was accurate, then you'll just have to read about it in our free ebook, written as a blog that explores in detail the real-life post-war youth subcultures that Grease, the movie, satirized. Yes, this short video was our sneaky way of promoting our free blog and ebook. But hey, we're forming a non-profit dedicated to researching post-war youth subcultures while taking a historical rather than a nostalgic approach to the teen history of the rock and roll era. And as part of that nonprofit, we'll be providing free resources for researchers and vintage culture fans, such as videos and articles and blogs. Providing free material to the community enables us to reach out for grants, which enables us to continue the research and provide more free material. You dig? So go to the post description and access the blog's link. We'll think you'll dig it the most because, just like with Grease in the mainstream, it's the word for the 1950s.